Hello everyone. In this episode, I spoke with Ras Tadrick, the Vice President of Robotics Research at TRI. In this episode, we spoke about Drake, the physics engine simulator they designed at TRI for rigid and soft bodies. And it was really interesting to go for these details of the physics engine tool and also what it could be hard problems for soft robotics. I am Marwa Dwini and this is the Soft Robotics podcast, and here's my interview. Thank you. So I'd like to ask you first how you'd like to define yourself.
How do I define myself? I guess I'm a roboticist. I'm a roboticist at MIT and at TRI, Toyota Research Institute. So I've been doing robots for a long time now. I feel like every time the new grad students come in, I realize how long I've been working at it. So
I'm curious to ask you, what could be the most hard question in robotics you still don't know answer for?
Well, there's long-term answers and there's mid-term answers. I think in the midterm, I think one of the things relevant to this podcast is I think we still haven't done enough to understand how to do control through contact, and that's a passion of mine. Long term, I think there's many huge open challenges. I understand you work on healing robots. I think that's a grand, we want robots that grow and heal and do all the things that, the good things that biology does. We want to understand the implications for a more general intelligence of embodied, artificial intelligence. So I think there's big long-term things, but I think soft robotics is right at this point where there's a lot of good things we can do and we will understand over the next few years.
Mm-hmm, great. And what could be the challenging? For example, for your TRI, what could be maybe the grounded challenges you still have to work on? Yeah.
I see. Okay, so at TRI, it's actually fantastic. We have been focused on trying to build robots that could help people in the home. And that's actually a fantastic vision, that it's actually important, even if it's not the shortest path to economic success. It's important for society, it's important for the world to address the problem of helping people age in place, and allowing robots to ultimately fulfill their purpose in the home. So at TRI, that is our North Star for the robotics effort, is to really think about the core capabilities that we want to invent that are required to get robots into the home.
Mm-hmm, great. So I was reading what you wrote about Drake and the open source robotics toolbox. So first of all, thanks for sharing that. And I just want to mention something because I think when I was reading, everything was very honest about the challenges we have for open source tools. And since 2 years, I was working on material and soft robotics. This material has very young models, and it was really hard even to capture its dynamics. And you speak in this about the tool that the most important thing is a physics engine. And that's something we struggle with in the community. I don't know. Of course, it depends what kind of properties or what kind of system we want to simulate. But when I was reading about what you try to stress about, it's very interesting. Even this comment I would like to mention here, you said that some people would say that the problem we are tackling in robotics are too complex to be treated with clean mathematics. And you said that you strongly disagree. And I find this really, reflecting a lot of things about how we design the physics engine simulator and what kind of intricacies we have that we can't really capture what we want exactly. If you can tell us more about that.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. I think that because of the success of deep learning, I think people are often quickly saying that we don't want to use physics-based solutions anymore. We want to use data-driven solutions. I think there are places where our physics-based solutions are so good that I wouldn't see abandoning them very quickly. I think there are problems where our physics-based solutions haven't given performant solutions, and I'm totally fine replacing them with data. If I wanted to pour liquid into then I think actually that one's on the bubble for me. I think Flex is a fantastic physics-based sort of simulator for something like that. Soft robotics I think is this intermediate regime where I think there are some aspects of soft that might be efficiently captured with data, but I still really believe that there's a lot more to be gained from physics-based understanding. Now, I think so. The soft simulation we do in Drake, we actually have a new team on the dynamics team working specifically on soft simulation. So you should expect more to come. But the stuff that's in there right now that I talked about in that blog post is think of it as a hard endoskeleton with soft skin. So it's relatively low deformation mode. We think of them as rigid bodies that have. We think about the rich contact of those rigid bodies in a low deformation mode. So where a lot of simulators will replace the contact between two rigid bodies with a point or a handful of points and summarize the force there, we will go do the extra work to compute a surface integral over a contact patch. And we find that leads to much more robust simulation around some of the corner cases in even rigid on rigid contact. And it's on this. I think it's a nice trade-off between computationally more expensive solutions and something that's performant but robust, seems to reproduce the real-world experiments very, very nicely. So that's work called the hydroelastic simulation that's been done by Michael Sherman and his team.
Mm-hmm. So for closing sim to real, I think that's something also interesting because you mentioned that there would be a large also deformation for soft robotics. So I don't know, how do you see that kind of a challenge here? Because it's very hard sometimes to do large deformation.
Right. I think from the simulation perspective, there's a couple tiers of extra complexity. So we are working on large deformation soft simulation now, but even then, I would say we're trying to avoid the hardest problems in very thin filament kind of simulation. Still, that'll be like for cloth. We won't do cloth in this round yet. That'll be yet another stage of evolution. So there are really hard. I mean, just the fundamental problem when the simulation is of a very thin material is that you suddenly, if you have any penetration whatsoever, you can have a puncture, and suddenly your contact forces might be coming out the other side of the material, and that gets very hard, and it requires a lot of numerical precision to do that well. So but I do think we'll have some very, very good for non-thin material soft simulation coming very soon.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about pushing the limitation, because sometimes, for example, when we see the failure happening in for example, soft robot to robot, how we can see that intubating the failure of in simulation. I don't know, how do you see that also? Is it still limitation, or how do you see this going?
This has changed a lot. I mean, I remember when we started pouring our effort into Drake as an open source project, I remember even my own students were very skeptical. They said, okay, you can't do manipulation research in simulation. I mean, legged robots, yeah, we've kind of been able to, but manipulation, you can't simulate that. And I think between around that time is when game engines were being realized as having sufficient photorealism to train perception systems, which is just a huge thing. Like, that wasn't something people believed in before, and now people do believe in that. And I think the context simulation is the other one, to be able to simulate at reasonable rates, sufficiently rich contact, so that we do see, for pretty sophisticated manipulation tasks, transfer from sim to real. We really do capture most of our failures in simulation and are able to reproduce them. Not everything. I mean, there are examples where we've seen, like, the rubber pad on our fingertip fell off on the robot. It's like, well, we didn't simulate that. But in terms of all of the more manipulation-focused things, it really does transfer wonderfully well these days.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think very interesting part about that you were conservative about releasing before, make sure it's mature. I think that's very interesting, because we had also episode with Professor Peter Cork, and he said that, although that I'm really a big advocate of open source and I really love it, but he said something that it's complexity. It leads to more complexity, and that's true. Sometimes we struggle sometimes with a lot of bugs and it doesn't work. But what you mentioned is very interesting, that how to make sure that the tools is mature and make sure that it's well maintained, and also because I
heard his quote. I heard that part of your episode, and I thought it was a great insight from Peter. And he said, I think that he's referring to a few things. I think, like, ROS was just a fantastic thing for open source robotics, right? But it does lead to people quickly assembling manipulation systems out of a grab bag of parts, where they say, I'll just grab this system, I'll grab this system, I'll grab this system, I'll put them into a ROS ecosystem and everything will just start working together. But it is very fragile when you do that. So it's true. I think there are a lot of open source tools out there. I think there are a few of them that are professionally engineered to the maturity that we've been trying to mature Drake. The code quality, if you look at the code reviews, they just require a lot. The documentation, is it's near perfect in terms of punctuation and capitalization. It's the quality is very, very high. And we've been, a little bit more slow and conservative. We don't want people to simulate something for the first time and watch it explode. We wanted to make sure that they don't have that experience when they play with our simulator. So, but I think now, having taken time to do it right, I'm very, very happy with where we are.
Mm-hmm. So just to finish about this part, you mentioned that it's ready to use already, and I see also deployed in startup, and I just see the tool. I don't know how do you see the community should use it or enhance it. Of course, it's open source, but what kind of maybe you aspire that to push again the limits of that?
That's a good question. So I think. Right now, we sort of targeted expert users first, and we've seen that, just in the sense of we're providing kind of a high-end capability, I guess, and it is, I think, the people that we've seen using it a lot, and there are, big companies and startups that are using it a lot. They're the ones that I think started off as experts and were able to use the full maturity of it. And I think now we're in a phase where we're saying, well, I think the tool is working very well, and we want to start making it more accessible to more people. So we've always had some tutorials and the like, but we've never really prioritized. Partly because honestly, I was afraid of doing support. It's a huge thing to actually support a tool for everybody's questions, but now that's the phase we're in. We're thinking that it's something that deserves to have more impact than we've tried to give it. So we're starting to burn down those other issues.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also curious about simulation, because that sometimes we don't know how to simulate perfectly uncertain environment. It's kind of very complex. I don't know how do you see this point as well.
Okay, so that's great. So Drake definitely has a state-of-the-art physics engine. It's super good and super proud. Like I said in that article, I think it's one of the most important features. But it's part of an ecosystem of thinking about things as systems that is bigger than just the physics engine. So there's a rigorous thinking about stochasticity. So in some other simulator, you might be fine just adding random numbers in the middle of a simulator, and that's perfectly reasonable for a lot of workflows. We try to encourage a workflow where you declare the randomness through a specific way to declare randomness in the system, so that if you want to, you can just simulate it and get random rollouts of simulations if you're doing reinforcement learning and that's all you need. But if you wanted to do stochastic or robust control, if you wanted to capture Gaussian uncertainty and propagate it through a nonlinear system, then there's some tools for doing that. And if you wanted to write an optimization that took advantage of particular structure and the uncertainty, then there's opportunities to do that too. So that has been, I think that's where this math comment I made that's where I show my bias here, is that I think there's a lot more that we can pull out of the system if we hold its structure a little bit farther, a little bit longer, and exploit all the detailed structure of the mechanics, of the uncertainty, all these other quantities.
Mm-hmm. Great. So coming back to, you have been teaching already on actuated robots, and even you mentioned that sometime although you was working in liquid robots, for example, manipulation is very much harder. But I'm curious to ask you in that case, what's something maybe you think is very challenging in that case? Because of course I will go to the point, because I think it's very interesting when you say that we sometimes suppress the dynamics or this kind of physics happen in the robot. And I saw your talks many times, but I think that even soft robotics is very related, that how we can really, extract this kind of dynamics or understand what could be beneficial or detrimental to the robot. Because I think it's very interesting, that point here.
So okay, let me be careful. I think that manipulation is harder to simulate. I think that they bring different aspects of control. I do think that the diversity and versatility of a manipulation system and all of the different variety of things you might want to manipulate and the levels of complexity there are significant. I think legs are awesome, and we should. I mean, there's still hard problems there. The dynamics take a more central stage in legged robots. I think Spot and the other robots that are built like Spot, Animal's beautiful, and they have captured a particular type of locomotion where you have very light legs and point feet, and they've basically mastered that. And now we have, it's so cool to see robots that are actually going to be out there in the world that are walking, and that's like they could be a product now. But there's more. I mean, we haven't completely solved the locomotion problem. There's plenty of hard problems still there too. I think because the thing that happened for me is that perception sort of happened. I mean, the computer vision revolution with deep learning made perception happen to the point where manipulation really is the challenge that it's of our time here, right? So that's one of the big reasons that I changed my focus to manipulation. And I hope I go back to, I think the lessons I'll learn in manipulation will transfer back to legged locomotion, and I fully expect to go back there again. I just like to focus on one thing at a time.
Okay. But for the dynamics, Jeff, I don't know if you can elaborate about how we can make sure that the dynamics we use or the natural dynamics or the physics is really beneficial, because sometimes when you use the controller, it's a question how we can make sure it doesn't really destroy this kind of dynamics happening.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful story from passive dynamic walkers, is let the physics do the work. We don't hear it as much in manipulation, but you do, of course, hear it. You hear about, Under Actuated Hands talks about that a bit. I saw a great talk just recently by Sharon Song talking about flicking towels. If you wanted to make a bed, you want to flick the towel out instead of, flick the sheet out instead of folding it statically. And dynamics matter there. And there are places in manipulation where dynamics are central, and the world has to do the work because you control your robot, but you don't control all the objects in the world completely, and you shouldn't aspire to. So that's where the under-actuated story transfers directly into manipulation. In the limiting case where you have a grasp, a force closure grasp on an object, and it moves with your hand, then you basically could be fully actuated again. But even if you have a fully actuated arm bolted to a table, if you started manipulating cloth or something like this, you are definitely in a highly under-actuated regime. The dynamics of the world are you must respect.
Great. So coming back to the controller, I don't know what you thought about that. Do you think that it could happen, for example, when you mentioned Steve Collins' example, that do you believe that, we can replace the controller completely and just using this kind of physics and dynamics? Do you think that's something we can do to replace the controller, or does it make sense to you?
No, I think they have to work in concert together, right? I think the best controller will do minimal work and let the physics do most of its work, but Steve's robot was the most beautiful robot I'd ever seen, but it only walks down ramps. And if you ever want to walk on the flat, you have to do something a little more. Well, he had a version that walked on the flat too. But we want to do both, right? I love this idea of a bird soaring in the wind, and the wind is doing most of the work. But if it needs to dive, down to get some food, then it's able to do that and take control. And that's the dance, I think, that we should have between control and dynamics. And I just only observe that a lot of times we're using all of our control effort and not enough of the dynamics.
Great. And coming back to redundancy in that case, I think that's something also very interesting, how for damage happening to a soft robot or robot, how they can adapt to certain situation like that, or how we can make sure the redundancy here is efficient in the system we're designing.
Okay, there's a couple aspects to that, and you're probably coming at it from an angle that I haven't thought as much about in terms of the healing itself. But certainly there are lessons from adaptive control about how do you adapt to failures in the system, or just constantly tune while guaranteeing some safety. There's a huge push from learning-based control now to try to constantly adapt as you're moving. So the idea that the controller should continue to adapt as you operate the robot, I think, is getting a lot of attention, and will continue to. It will be super important as we go forward. Now, if you are asking about the hardware continuing to adapt, I think that is awesome. I think that we should be working on that. We should definitely do that. I haven't done any work in that space, but I think that's a great problem.
So better than that, do you think we should investigate more in the software side or the design, the body itself?
It's the same dance, right? I think that those things have to be coupled. I think, better, we'll see, okay. I do think that there are examples, and maybe the first famous one was the early PR2 video where the teleoperated robot was doing most of the tasks we wanted to do in the home, right? And even it's a simple robot with a 2-finger gripper, but if you put an intelligent enough brain behind it, you can do a lot of very useful things. So I think it would be too simple for us to say the hardware isn't good enough. I don't think that's true. I think if we had a really good software stack, then we can do lots and lots of things. But we should keep working on the hardware too, of course. And I think it's through those things working together that we're going to really realize the possibilities of robotics going into new places, doing superhuman performance. I mean, we're already seeing superhuman performance in Atlas, for instance. Atlas does things that I can't do, and it's incredible to watch. And we should expect that. Robots should be superior to us in many physical tasks, right?
Mm-hmm. But I'm curious in that case, what could be other designs we speak about that the robot can do certain performance we can do as a human, and it's related to the fitness and the environment. So I don't know, how do you see maybe inspiration or something beyond what you see already in robotics, and we don't really, maybe we didn't consider yet. I don't know. For you, do you see anything like designs that just you wish were in robotics?
When I do think about soft robots, I wonder how much our entire world, I mean, even if I look around me at my keyboard and my screen and everything, we've engineered a pretty rigid world. And I wonder if we've done that because of because that's where Newtonian classical mechanics worked really well, and we could engineer ourselves into tight tolerances, and that's what we began machining very well. And it's not clear, though, if you really introduced totally new fabrication techniques and softness everywhere, and whether we'd really want all of these things. Some of them I would want to be rigid, probably, but some of them it might open up the design space enough that I wouldn't actually choose all of these things to be very boxy and rigid. So beyond robotics, I do think, some of the push that we're making in soft robotics, I hope will actually impact manufacturing more broadly. And of course, there's manufacturing more broadly that's influencing robotics. But I don't know exactly how to answer is there something I've seen out there that we haven't pulled in to robotics? I think there's any cool idea you had, somebody's built a robot like that at some point. Whether it worked well or not is a different question, but there's a lot of people who've done a lot of really cool things in robots. It's hard to find something that's never been tried or never been done.
Maybe in that case, how we approach the problem, or maybe when you try to, from your experiences, sometimes we have this kind of research question, or I want to do that thing, but how you approach this kind of solution, because sometimes it's uncertain, and you don't know whether you selected the right solution or not. I don't know how we approach new ideas or to find a solution for that.
Well, so that is the art of doing research, I guess. And I think different people have different styles. I do think that I do my best to combine rigorous thinking and understanding the details and understanding theorems when appropriate, or rigorous mathematics, certainly appreciating them and talking to people who understand them very well, and but also trying to think big, and so I try to have people in the lab who are thinking outside the box, and I have some people in the lab that really they can bring a mathematical talent that we didn't have before, and I like to try to live on that edge and understand when we can take something that was hard to think about before, try to make it a little bit more precise, think big, but also think rigorously.
And through your career, I don't know if you have a result was counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense to you. I don't know what's surprising. Maybe through the modeling, but when you try to deploy it in reality, it was surprising or counterintuitive.
Yeah, to say the maybe obvious example recently is this idea of over-parameterization having changed the way we think about optimization, and that it getting around some of the, to some extent getting around some of the hard problems that we think of in non-convex optimization. But as we dig in a little deeper, I think there's some things it does extremely well and other things where it hasn't solved the entire non-convex optimization problem. In terms of actual robots, I mean, I think there's robots out there that surprise me all the time. I think in terms of dexterous manipulation, Ishikawa's overclocked robotic hands are some of my favorite. He has these high-speed hands, and if you haven't watched them, you should look for the high-speed hands by the Ishikawa lab and watch them doing high-speed twirling and high-speed dribbling a basketball and catching balls. This is my favorite example where I just think, oh, that was just beautifully done. I mean, I would say that when I was thinking about your podcast, I think for me, I want to be clear that I think about soft robotics probably a little different than a lot of people you talk to. For me, I think of it as rich contact and rich contact sensing, right? So for me, it's a lot of people I think are thinking about the fabrication side of soft robotics, which is hugely important. And I don't mean to say in any way that it's not important. It's just that I don't work on that as much. For me, it's making really rich contact with the world. And there are some soft robots out there that are beautifully designed, and then they still only touch the world at their end effector. And I think that's not the point. Come on, you need to wrap around and hug everything and understand the implications for control and perception, because a surprising amount of our understanding about how to program robots has been made where you kind of assume that you're touching the robot at the end effector. And if you think about basic core capabilities like impedance control or something like this, if you don't know where on the robot you're going to be touching, those tools need to be adapted, right? I think there are fundamental challenges, even at the simple level of impedance control. But then if you want to control some under-actuated object with rich contact all up and down your body, this is just an open problem. And so those are the parts that really excite me, is being able to touch all over the place and thinking about the implications for perception.
I really like this point. I don't know, for example, I think this is really hard the problem, but I don't know why do you think maybe the community in soft robotics, we don't focus more on this point, because it's challenging, do you believe, or maybe because I think also in your blog you say that in academia sometimes the solution is different. When you work in academic problem, it's just different from real world applications. So do you think if you mention a real problem, it's really challenging?
I mean, I think there's a natural course of these things. I think one of the first things we had to do was open up all these new avenues of fabrication and to understand what they could be good for. What actually works, what's reliable. Can we make a soft energy source? Can we, all these different things. These are awesome questions. And now, I mean, some people are definitely doing it already, but I think now is the time where the focus could also include the planning and control more. Now that we start being able to fabricate some very interesting soft concepts, now how do we control them? How do we embed sensors in them? And what sensors would enable us to really take advantage of this? I mean, we're changing the mechanics of contact, in an important way. And, I don't think we fully understood the right way to do that. How soft, how stiff should your robot be if you wanted to manipulate the things in the kitchen? What about the things in the garage? Is that a different answer? Right? Would you build a different robot? These are great questions.
That's a very excellent point. But you think that, I think that's, you speak about multi-material, how we can have this kind of hybrid design for compliant and rigid material. How do you see this kind of, because I was looking to even in nature, how there's spider, they build their web to be redundant, so there's damage happening, the whole structure still exists, and it seemed this concept is very interesting, but I don't know, there's no kind of methodology how you can arrange them in a certain way or optimize them so that you can achieve a certain functionality. How do you see these problems as well, using different structure with different morphology?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's some crazy new cool stuff coming out of AI for design too, right? Where you can think of new, new shapes, patterns, topologies that have structural properties that didn't come out of our our human engineered brain, our engineering brains yet, and they're coming out and they can have these nice properties. That's a cool area. I don't know what it's going to look like in a few years, but it's fun to see those kind of designs. The problem, of course, with AI and optimization is fully specifying the problem, especially for design. I would think is that we have it in control. For instance, so if I say, I want the robot to move forward, the most famous example in my mind is Carl Sims, who was doing these evolving creatures way back a long time ago with genetic algorithms. Right, and he says, I want the center of mass to move forward. And so what did the robots evolve to do? They were extremely tall, and when the simulator started, they just fell forward, right? And they go, okay, well, that's not what I wanted. Here's something else. And people talk about this as the value alignment problem in artificial intelligence, but in design space, I would think it's incredibly tough because a good mechanical designer has so many things in their head about what makes this design effective, with materials, suppliers, different, it's very hard, I think, to fully specify the problem that you want the design algorithm to optimize and make sure you didn't miss anything. And we face the same problem in controls. But I think it's a cool area, a very cool area.
And maybe also a cool question here about the problems you mentioned, but when you speak about robotics or soft robotics, how we can make sure that if we speak about being in our home for 7 years, I don't know how many years, this kind of how we can anticipate to continue learning and also to be adapted and be generic. When we publish the paper, sometimes we speak about the lifetime. We don't go for the whole lifespan or just, I don't know if you agree with that or...
No, absolutely. We have a couple projects happening right now at TRI, and it speaks to this actually. So we have the soft robotics project, which you've talked to Alex Alsbach about, and Punyo, the Punyo project, which, by the way, they're hiring. So if anybody's listening and wants to do soft robotics at TRI. But also the other two projects, actually, one of them we call intuitive physics. This is just on the manipulation team in Cambridge that I've been working with. We have a project on intuitive physics, and we have a project on lifelong learning. And the lifelong learning, I think, is exactly what you're talking about, where you think about the fact that there's some amount of data coming, some type of data that's coming in right now. There's some situation that the robot is in now, and of course you'd like to optimize to some extent to that current data. But the data, the distribution of the data, whether it's the weather that changes over the course of a year, or the body that changes over the course of a lifetime, how do you continue to adapt, and how quickly do you adapt to this changing distributions? You would like to somehow be better at grilling on the barbecue in the summer, but not forget how to make your favorite Christmas dinner, right? Every year. Somehow there's a trade-off between how we specialize and how we generalize. And I think the lifelong learning is a theme, that's very popular in machine learning right now. It captures this idea very nicely. There's hard theoretical questions there, and there's lots of interesting practical ideas.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a good point. But maybe a quick question here. Do you think there is something, speaking of robotics, or maybe it's through TRI, in designing some unavoidable trade-offs? Because sometimes we have the trade-off, we can't really get rid of that sometimes. I don't know if you have something like that.
Give me an example of what you mean.
Yeah, I'm speaking for soft robotics. Sometimes especially in soft robotic actuators, sometimes we have very low speed actuator, and for the sake of having high force. So that's a trade-off here, and we still don't know how we can have actuator with very high of course, for speed and also enough forces, but there's something still a limitation and a trade-off apparently.
So that helps me. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So even the very question of how soft should an end effector be, or an appendage. If I want to have a robot, we've worked on robots loading the dishwasher. We've worked on robots doing a lot of kind of household tasks. Of course, if you're too soft, then you can't do more precise control, right? There is some fundamental compromise there. I think if you want to be very high speed, very precise, then it's actually better to be hard. So I think you do walk some trade-off. in the design space between softness and hardness, right? Right. The fundamental thing is about bandwidth, I think, more than anything, right? If you put the series elastic actuator for me is a clear way to think about it. So if you take a series, you take a rigid actuator, let's say, and you put a series element inside it, then how does that change the control you can do at the end? Like it's great in the sense that you can if you have a sudden impact, you are protecting your actuator from this sudden impact. That's a great bonus of having softness, of course. But it also means it reduces the bandwidth of your control at the end effector, right? You can only control it through the stiffness of that spring. So I think that does characterize a trade-off that's real in terms of if you choose a particular mechanical design. Now, variable stiffness series elastic actuator became a thing to do, and I could totally see, and I'm sure there's work already on variable stiffness materials. I guess I know there's materials that are variable stiffness already that could change that. Even if you imagine if your skin were to get harder or softer actively in order to accommodate, that's super cool.
Yeah. So maybe we can pick the questions. Robert asks you, what do you think are the most important advancements that needed to happen in materials to move soft robotics field forward?
So in the short term, I think reliability is, so when we've worked with soft sensors and soft, end effectors and the like, we trade off how quickly we can iterate through them and how reliable they are, right? If we start manipulating a lot of things, our soft sensors, our soft materials start to degrade. That's just needs more, to some extent, it just needs more engineering work to dial in the durability with the particular material properties we're looking at. But that in the short term, I do feel that there's some pain still there. In the long term, I think self-healing is perfect. I think you're working on the right thing. So, to think that a robot after it's left the lab could continue to exist even if it takes a little damage or something like that, I think that is a beautiful dream.
Wonderful. And I also have a question from Shamil. I think you answered for part of that, but he asks you initially work at legged robots when you are full-time at MIT, then you switch it to manipulation. Why did you give up legged robots? And what are the current challenges in legged robots? And if someone lead a new lab in legged robots, what should focus on?
A new lab in legged robots. So there's definitely important hard questions in legged robots, and I wouldn't say I've given up on them. I just, like I say, I like to focus, and I think the interaction between perception and control is super rich in manipulation, but I think it could be a lot richer in terms of locomotion too, right? I think most of our locomotion systems today perceive the world mostly as either something I can step on or something I shouldn't step on, and roughly geometry. There's higher forms of manipulation of locomotion possible. Most of our locomotion systems, touch the world with only a few preordained spots on the robot still, and this is the soft robotics thing, right? I mean, if I'm allowed to make contact all over my body, not just at my feet, then I can potentially open up many more, types of locomotion. That's still hard. I think that's still hard. I wonder how well Spot can do it, for instance, but I think there's probably cases that would throw even Spot for a loop right now. I think that the hardware has gotten so much better. The hardware that we see in Spot and Atlas and in these other robots is just fantastic. So the one thing I maybe wouldn't recommend, I used to build little legged robots myself, and we used, and our passive walkers, we would build ourselves and the like. It's harder to get into design for legged robots. You'd have to just take a different take on design, because now that industry is involved, I think the field has changed a bit. And I remember when it started happening, I went to some of my friends who were in fields that had already gone through that transformation, like semiconductors and other things. And I said, so how does this work now that industry has come into our field and I can't compete? I can't build a robot that a team of 100 engineers could build in an MIT lab. So you just have to, I think you collaborate with industry, and you find, the problems that are a few years out that industry isn't thinking about yet that you can still do at a scale. But this is a great place for the field to have gone. I mean, this is success. So it's not a bad thing. It just means that you have to be a little bit more strategic. I wouldn't try to build a robot that's competing directly with Spot. I think Spot's pretty amazing and hard to beat. So.
And you also spoke about simplicity, and I'm curious about what you mean about simplicity. Is it mean about the design or the capturing the significant data? Because when you, for example, the design, what could be the first step you have to consider or more significant to you? I don't know if you can a little bit more about simplicity here.
Yeah. So let me speak about it from the language, from the lens of control, because I've thought about that maybe the most. I do a lot of work in optimal control, for instance, and using optimization, even if it's not optimal, but approximately optimal control. And I think there's super powerful tools there. A lot of times, though, I think we're still in the regime where we take a problem, we put it through this recipe, and the thing we get out is fairly complicated. And I believe that when we start asking the right questions of our optimization, the thing that pops out the other end is very simple. And the reason I think that is because there are people, have always been people, we have some in our lab, both at MIT and at TRI, that we like to call them robot whisperers, who can program a robot. If you say, I want my robot to do X, where X is almost anything, people can write very simple controllers relatively that can do incredibly impressive things, maybe in a narrow domain. But if you just say, I want to just make it happen once, give me a controller, or even sometimes very robustly. But it takes them a lot of creativity and time, so it's maybe not it won't compete with a learning solution in the long run. But the things that they can write down are often very, very simple. And the things that it's hard to know what we're getting out of reinforcement learning right now. Even when we talk about deep RL, deep reinforcement learning, a lot of times the actual control network is actually not that deep. It's only a couple layers of and hundreds of neurons. So it's hard to know how complicated or how simple those are. But I believe strongly that a lot of the tasks we want our robots to do can be accomplished with relatively simple controllers, and that simplicity will ultimately lead to robustness. So, and just happiness as researchers, like we've understood something, we've compressed something very complicated into something we can understand. That's, I think, success for me.
Wonderful. So, since we're close to the end, I have a few questions. Maybe the first one, I think, from the experience you had in academia and now industry, I don't know what could be sometimes be differences in way of thinking. Because we spoke previous episode with some people, they mentioned this sometimes there's differences in way of thinking. I don't know for you what was different.
There's important ways of thinking. I mean, it's definitely different, very complementary, I would say. Like in a robotics lab, I think one thing that's different. So when I have my MIT hat on and I'm talking to my MIT students, one of the things we try to do is I always try to make sure that every student individually has a project that will lead to their thesis that is unique and different, right? So everybody has an intellectual core nugget. And that ultimately limits, to some extent, what we can do in the group. Sometimes, and when we did the DARPA challenge, actually, we kind of threw that aside and said, let's just make this robot work no matter what. And it doesn't matter if Greg did this or Lucas did this. It was just, let's make the robot work. I think in industry, industrial research, there's a little bit more of that attitude. We're going to try to make something happen that's never happened. Of course, that's true in both, but the role of the individual is down a little bit and the role of the outcome is up a little bit. And I think that can just change the type of outcomes that you get. You can get some spectacular, demonstrations. We often combine engineering, professional engineers with researchers so we can get more spectacularly engineered systems. There are different focuses in those two, different mindsets in those two. But I think they're very complementary. And actually, I think one of the great things that TRI did was by putting themselves next to Stanford and next to Michigan and next to MIT, you kind of have a very good flow of information there. And MIT, my gosh, I would never, I mean, I just love MIT. I just love the people I get to interact with. I just feel lucky every day.
Wonderful, yeah. And I don't know if you have moment of doubt sometimes when I don't know, do you have any moment of doubt or in your career or in the projects you're doing? Because sometimes we doubt sometimes. I don't know if you have moments like that.
Oh, sure. Well, in the micro scale, I sometimes wonder if the thing I'm working on is going to be important. In the macro scale of like my career, yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see what type of impact we totally have. I feel proud of the things that have already happened and the impact that I feel that I've had. I hope I continue to contribute things to the world, but of course it's a constant question of, am I working on the right things? You know, how fast is the world changing? Am I keeping up? But I think if you only keep up, then you're gonna chase a lot of maybe you know, shiny new ideas, but maybe not stay true to your core focus. So I think for a lot of us today, I would say that's a big challenge, is that the you know, machine learning has brought so many new people in, and there's so much excitement and so much enthusiasm. It's hard to know how much to chase the newest results versus stay true to a particular philosophy or approach that I've had for years. So I think finding the balance there is always a place that I question myself and I challenge myself.
Mm-hmm. And when you try to think about maybe crazy ideas, sometimes when you think, I wish that something could happen down the road, like 10, 20 years, I don't know what you think. Do you have any kind of thought like that, or you are more pragmatic about?
I definitely, let's see, sometimes I pride myself in being willing to have a crazy idea. Sometimes my students definitely roll their eyes at me. In a weird way, I actually feel like we had RSS this past week. This week it's still going, I guess. I think we have a lot of people with crazy ideas right now. I don't think I need to have lots of crazy ideas right now. I think the field's got a lot of them. So which is good, which is awesome. It's a time of great change and great excitement. Maybe I feel like the thing I could help with the field is you know, low pass filtering a little bit and sticking true to some of the things that I know and believe in. So I go back and forth with this. I think I try to take the pulse of the field, but I'm not worried about the field having too few crazy ideas right now. I think it's a very vibrant time.
Perfect. So a few questions. First one, is ego important for you as a researcher when you have new ideas? I don't know. How do you deal with the ego?
Ego of whether it's a good idea, or whether I'm a good researcher. You know, I do think there's a thing that happens when you're a young researcher trying to prove yourself. I would say, you know, I don't know if you want to call it imposter syndrome or something like that. I think I've mostly gotten past that. I mean, I don't think that. I think I've come to terms with what I've you know, I'm happy with what I've contributed. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I hope I can continue to contribute more. I probably worry too much about you know, whether my paper is going to be the, you know, am I writing a paper right now that's going to get cited a lot? I still worry about that probably. Just, you know, that's the human nature maybe, but less than I used to, and that's good. I really I just want to be working on robots most of the time. That's all I really need left.
What could be the most important quality maybe you have gained?
I do keep track of this kind of thing. You know, like what have I gained from interacting with different people? And there's different people have given me so many different things. And TRI has given me some incredible views of the world that I never had before. And there's incredible people at TRI that open my eyes. You know, at MIT, I would say, if I had to point out the single biggest influence, I'd say, on the way I think about things, it's been interacting with optimization and controls people at MIT, and the way that they see the world with such clarity. I think that robotics should achieve that. Now, controls, I mean, a lot of people in machine learning complain because controls often encrypts what these ideas that they've had and don't communicate them in a way that it's accessible to everybody. So I hope we can do better with that. But I think the clarity of thought that can be applied to even very, very complex systems is something that I think MIT has given me that I hope to carry forward as far as I possibly can.
That's a good point. Maybe a quick question here. How do you make sure you have this kind of clarity of thought? Because sometimes we have this kind of, that trendy thing, or how do you make sure this have, or enhance to be clear in thinking of problem? What could contribute on that?
I also don't want to suggest that being audacious and going beyond what you can think clearly about today. I think there's important things to do there too, but I think more. I'm not willing to say the bitter lesson. Let's say that clear thinking of humans is just going to slow us down. Data tells the story, and simple algorithms applied at large scale will solve everything. Maybe it will solve everything, and I'm actually not against that. I do that in principle, but as a scientist, I feel like my job is to distill the complexity into something beautiful and simple that we can generalize as much as possible, understand as deeply as possible, and if just to make me a happy individual, that's my goal. So but I think those things are in a happy tension to do some crazy things that we can't possibly understand, realize we haven't been thinking about things the right way, but then follow them up with some rigorous thinking.
So great. So lastly, I don't know if through your career or project, I don't know, anything was kind of advice shifted your way of thinking. I don't know, maybe early on that it changed your perspective or advice, or you say even though something makes you shift your way of thinking, maybe towards problems, or I don't know, in general.
I would say this, that the answer I just gave, I think, is the best example. Definitely the thinking about things. I mean, I started at Michigan, University of Michigan, learned a ton there. I learned how to be a computer engineer, computer scientist, learned so much. When I came to MIT, I learned that I hadn't treated mathematics seriously enough, and the rigorous thinking started more than, when I joined TRI, I definitely upgraded my software skills. And I've learned from some extremely talented software engineers, and I continue to learn in all of these areas all the time. And the best thing I can do, from my perspective, is just to surround myself with people that know a lot more than I do about different things, and continue to try to grow and make better robots.
Great, wonderful. So I don't know if you have any final words you'd like to say for Robotics community. Do you have any final words you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think soft robotics is this incredible time. I really think we don't know exactly where it's going to pay off, but I completely believe that robots are not going to look the same in a few years as they look right now. I don't think anybody wants the robots we're building right now in their living room, and I think softness can help with that. I think better manufacturing can help with that. I think AI and controls and optimization is going to play a role in that, but bringing these all together is just a fantastic thing to do, and I'm looking forward to the next few years.
Thanks so much, Russ. It was very inspiring and really enjoyed listening to you. Thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you for doing it. Okay.